Thomas sat in his father's study for the first time in 17 years. The leather chair still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, though his father had been dead for 3 months. Outside, March rain tapped against the windows of the Chicago brownstone, the same sound that had accompanied countless childhood evenings when he'd been forbidden from entering this room. Now, he owned it. All of it. He ran his fingers along the mahogany desk, feeling the grooves worn smooth by decades of his father's restless hands. The estate attorney had left an hour ago, papers signed, inheritance transferred. His sister Claire hadn't contested anything. She'd simply stopped returning his calls 2 weeks after the funeral, which was answer enough. His younger brother Daniel had sent a single text. Hope it was worth it. Thomas told himself he deserved this house, these assets, the portfolio that would secure his daughter's futures. He'd been the one who stayed close, who managed his father's decline through Alzheimer's, who coordinated hospice care, while Claire built her career in San Francisco, and Daniel drifted through ashrams in India. But the justifications felt thin now, sitting in the silence his father had left behind. The lawyer had explained it carefully, almost apologetically. The will was recent, drafted just 14 months ago during what the neurologist had called a window of clarity between cognitive episodes. Everything to Thomas. A house in Lincoln Park worth $2.3 million. Investment accounts. The small publishing company his father had built from nothing. Claire and Daniel received token amounts, $5,000 each, along with brief, formal acknowledgements of their existence. Thomas opened the desk drawer. Inside were the usual remnants: unused letterhead, rubber bands, a silver letter opener, and beneath them, a leather journal he'd never seen before. His father hadn't been a journal keeper. The man had built his life on action, not reflection, but the handwriting on the first page was unmistakably his father's, the script still firm, dated 2 years ago. He closed the journal without reading further and placed it back in the drawer. Some things, he decided, didn't need to be known. His phone buzzed. His wife, Rachel. "Girls want to know if we're keeping the house or selling. Emily's already planning which room she wants." He stared at the message without responding. Emily was 13, old enough to understand what inheritance meant, but young enough to see it as purely good fortune, a windfall that changed nothing except their financial circumstances. The house settled around him, floorboards creaking in that particular pattern he'd memorized as a child. His father had bought this place in 1981, back when the neighborhood was affordable for a young publisher with more ambition than capital. Thomas had learned to walk in the hallway upstairs, had hidden behind the velvet curtains in the living room during games of hide-and-seek with Claire and Daniel. Claire had been the brilliant one, the child who devoured books and asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. Daniel had been the artist, always drawing, always somewhere else in his head. And Thomas had been the responsible one, the mediator, the son who understood what their father needed without being told. It had seemed like enough once. He thought about the last real conversation he'd had with his father, 6 months before the Alzheimer's stole language from him entirely. They'd been sitting in this same study, going over financial documents, and his father had looked at him with sudden clarity. "You've always been here," his father had said. "That matters." Thomas had taken it as approval, maybe even love. Now he wondered if it had been something else entirely, a statement of fact, not gratitude, an observation without judgment, the way one might note that winter always follows autumn. The rain intensified. He should go home. Rachel and the girls were waiting, probably already discussing paint colors and furniture arrangements. But he remained in the chair, watching shadows lengthen across the bookshelves. His father had been a collector of first editions, mostly American literature. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Steinbeck, stories about men who made hard choices and lived with the consequences. His phone rang. Claire. His hand moved toward it, then stopped. He hadn't spoken to her since the reading of the will, when she'd simply stood, collected her coat, and walked out of the lawyer's office without looking at him. 20 years of sibling affection dissolved in that single gesture. He'd tried calling her that evening, left a voicemail saying they should talk, that he could explain. She never responded. Daniel's silence was different. Daniel had always been harder to read, comfortable with ambiguity in a way that made Thomas uncomfortable. When their mother died 8 years ago, Daniel had disappeared for 3 months, resurfacing with a shaved head and a calmness that seemed both genuine and unreachable. He'd hugged Thomas at the funeral, said all the right things, then left again. Geography was Daniel's preferred method of managing family complications. Thomas stood and walked to the window. The street was empty except for a dog walker hunched against the rain. This neighborhood had changed dramatically. Where there had once been corner bodegas, there were now artisanal coffee shops. The old families had mostly sold and moved to the suburbs. His father had refused every developer's offer, insisted the house was worth more than money, though he'd never explained what he meant by that. In the desk drawer, the journal waited. Thomas knew he would eventually read it, just as he knew he was avoiding it for a reason. Some truths arrive too late to change anything, serving only as evidence of what we already suspected about ourselves. He locked the study door behind him and stood in the hallway, listening to the house breathe. Tomorrow he would bring Rachel and the girls to see it properly, let them imagine their lives expanding into these rooms. Tonight, he needed to go home and pretend that inheritance was simple, that receiving everything meant he'd lost nothing at all. The transition happened in increments. First, Rachel and the girls stayed over on weekends, treating the brownstone like a vacation home. Emily claimed the third-floor bedroom with the window seat, while Sophie, who was 10, chose the room that overlooked the small backyard garden. Rachel moved through the spaces with an interior designer's eye, measuring windows and photographing wall colors, excited in a way Thomas hadn't seen in years. By June, they'd sold their house in Evanston and moved in completely. Thomas kept his father's study mostly unchanged, telling Rachel he needed time to sort through everything. The journal remained in the drawer, a small weight he felt even when he wasn't in the room. His consulting work continued from the home office he set up in what had been a guest room, corporate crisis management, helping companies navigate scandals and public relations disasters. He was good at it, understanding instinctively how to reshape narratives, how to turn liability into opportunity. Clients paid him substantial fees to make their problems disappear into careful language and strategic silence. Claire sent a letter in July, not to the brownstone but to his business address. It arrived in a plain envelope with a San Francisco postmark. Inside was a single page, handwritten, her script smaller and tighter than he remembered. "I won't challenge the will," she wrote. "Not because I accept it, but because I refuse to let what he did define the rest of my life. I've spent years in therapy understanding that his love was always conditional, always tactical. I'm disappointed but not surprised that he weaponized his estate. What does surprise me is that you went along with it, that you never called to say this wasn't right, that you never suggested splitting things fairly regardless of what the document said. I thought better of you. I was wrong. Don't contact me again." Thomas read the letter 3 times, then filed it away in his desk. He drafted 7 different responses over the following weeks. None of them felt true, so he sent nothing. Daniel's silence remained absolute. Thomas hired a private investigator in August, paying $2,000 to learn that his brother was teaching English at a small university in Chiang Mai, Thailand. The investigator sent photos: Daniel at an outdoor market, Daniel on a motorcycle, Daniel laughing with a group of students at a riverside cafe. He looked healthy, unburdened, like someone who'd successfully excised a tumor and moved on. Rachel noticed his distraction. They were in bed one night in September, the window open to let in the cooler air, when she turned to him in the darkness. "You've been somewhere else for months." "Just work stress," he said. "You've handled Fortune 500 scandals without losing sleep. This is something else." He wanted to tell her about the journal, about Claire's letter, about the growing certainty that he'd mistaken proximity for virtue. But the words wouldn't form correctly. Instead he said, "I keep thinking about what my father wanted." He wanted you to have the house, he made that clear. Did he? Or did he want to make sure Claire and Daniel knew they'd disappointed him? Rachel was quiet for a long moment. Then, does it matter? You can't fix his relationships with them. You can only decide what kind of relationship you want. But she didn't understand. It wasn't about wanting. It was about deserving, about whether the years he'd spent managing his father's decline had been genuine care or simply a long audition for this exact outcome. He'd never asked himself that question before. Now he couldn't stop asking it. The anniversary of his father's death arrived in October. Thomas went to the cemetery alone, stood at the grave with its fresh headstone and felt nothing. Not grief, not peace, just a dull recognition that the man who'd shaped his entire understanding of responsibility was gone, leaving behind only property and questions. When he returned to the brownstone, he found Emily in the study. She'd let herself in somehow, was sitting at the desk with a book. "Sorry," she said, startled. "I was just reading. I like how quiet it is in here." "It's fine," Thomas said. "What are you reading?" She held up a worn paperback. "The Great Gatsby, for school. It's about this guy who makes all this money to impress a girl, but it's actually about something else." "What else?" Emily thought about it, her face serious in the way of teenagers trying on adult ideas. "About wanting things you can't have, I guess. Or about how the past stays with you even when you think you've moved on." Thomas felt something shift in his chest. "That's a smart reading." "Everyone dies at the end," Emily said. "I hate when everyone dies." After she left, Thomas opened the desk drawer and took out the journal. He'd been avoiding it for 7 months. The time for avoidance was over. His father's handwriting grew shakier as the entries progressed, the disease stealing precision before it stole meaning. The early entries were mundane: notes about meetings, reminders about doctor's appointments, observations about the weather. Then, about 30 pages in, the tone changed. Thomas called again today about the will. "He doesn't ask directly, but I know what he wants to hear. That I'm thinking of him, that loyalty will be rewarded. I should tell him the truth, but I'm too much of a coward. The truth is that I'm angry. Angry at Claire for choosing her career over staying close. Angry at Daniel for rejecting everything I built. Angry at myself for caring so much about being chosen. Thomas is the only one who stayed, but he stayed because that's who he is, not because of me. I'm taking advantage of his nature. I know this. I'm doing it anyway." Thomas read the entry 3 times, then continued through the journal. Page after page of his father's deteriorating conscience, a man watching himself make a cruel choice while fully understanding its cruelty. The will was mentioned repeatedly, always with the same awareness. This is wrong, but I'm doing it. This will hurt them, but my hurt matters more. The final entry was dated 2 weeks before the lawyer drafted the will. Saw the neurologist. She says I have perhaps a year before the decline becomes severe. I've decided to finalize everything this week. Thomas is coming by Friday. I'll tell him it's handled, that he doesn't need to worry. I won't tell him that I've made him the instrument of my revenge against his siblings for not being who I wanted them to be. That seems too much of a burden to place on him while I'm still alive. Let him discover it after. Let him decide what to do with it. That's my final test for him, I suppose. Will he keep everything, or will he prove himself better than me? Thomas closed the journal. His hands were shaking. Outside, the October darkness pressed against the windows. Downstairs, he could hear Rachel preparing dinner, Emily's music playing faintly from her room, Sophie's voice asking some question about homework. He sat in his father's chair, in the house that had become his prize, and understood with perfect clarity that he'd been given not an inheritance, but a verdict. His father had known exactly what he was doing, had weaponized the will not just against Claire and Daniel, but against Thomas himself. The greatest cruelty wasn't the unequal distribution. It was the knowledge of it, the unavoidable complicity, the impossible choice between keeping everything and admitting the entire foundation was rotten. Thomas opened his laptop and began typing. He would need a lawyer, different one from the estate attorney, someone who could help him undo what his father had done, if such a thing was even possible now, 7 months later, with the house already remodeled and the investments already transferred. He worked until midnight, drafting scenarios, calculating numbers, trying to find a version of fairness that wouldn't destroy his own family's security in the process. But every scenario required one thing: contact with Claire and Daniel, an acknowledgement of what had happened, of what he'd accepted, a confession that would change how they saw him forever, if they didn't already see him that way. He closed the laptop. Tomorrow, he decided. He would figure this out tomorrow. It was a lie he would tell himself every day for the next 4 months. February brought a late winter storm that shut down the city for 3 days. Thomas was trapped in the brownstone with Rachel and the girls, the office closed, everyone's routines suspended. On the second day, while clearing snow from the front steps, he found a package wedged against the door. No postage, no return address, just his name written in handwriting he didn't immediately recognize. Inside was a manila folder containing photocopies of documents, bank statements, property transfers, a contract dated 4 years ago. It took Thomas several minutes to understand what he was looking at, and then several more to accept it. His father hadn't just written an unfair will. He'd systematically transferred assets out of the publishing company during the 2 years before his Alzheimer's diagnosis, creating a separate LLC that existed only on paper. Money had flowed out steadily, documented in these statements roughly $300,000 total. The LLC had one listed employee, Thomas Garrett, with his signature on the incorporation documents. Except Thomas had never seen these documents before, had never signed anything related to an LLC, had never received any money from any entity except his own consulting firm. His father had forged his signature, had created a paper trail suggesting that Thomas had been embezzling from the family company for years, had been quietly stealing while pretending to help manage the business. The documents were sophisticated, carefully constructed, illegal but convincing enough to create reasonable doubt about Thomas's character. There was a note at the bottom of the folder, handwritten on plain paper. Found these while helping settle Dad's affairs. Thought you should know they exist. The accounting firm that handled the estate never saw them. They were in a safety deposit box Dad opened under a different name. I'm guessing he planned to use them if you ever questioned the will. Insurance, in case you got curious about why everything went to you. That's who he was. That's what he thought of all of us. I'm sending this because you deserve to know what he made you into, even if it's fake. Whether you do anything about it is your choice. I won't mention this to Claire or anyone else. As far as I'm concerned, this is your problem now, not mine. D. Thomas stood in the study holding the folder, snow melting from his boots onto the hardwood floor. The implications came in waves. His father had not only divided the inheritance unfairly, but he'd created leverage against Thomas in case Thomas ever tried to rectify it. Evidence of embezzlement, false but documented, that would destroy Thomas's reputation and possibly lead to criminal charges if anyone looked closely. The perfect insurance policy. His father had built a trap with no exits. Thomas could keep everything and live with the guilt, or he could try to make things right and risk exposure of evidence that painted him as a thief. Either way, the family was destroyed. Either way, his father won. Rachel knocked on the study door. "I've been in there for 2 hours, everything okay?" "Fine," he called back, "just dealing with some old paperwork." He spent the rest of the day researching fraud law, trying to understand whether forged documents could still cause him problems, even if he could prove they were forged. The answer was complicated. Proving forgery would require extensive forensic analysis, potentially depositions, certainly attention from authorities. And even if he could prove the documents were fake, questions would linger. Why had his father gone to such lengths? What was Thomas hiding? The mere existence of the accusation could damage his consulting business, his reputation, his marriage. That evening, he tried calling Daniel. The number he had went to an automated message in Thai. He sent an email. "We need to talk. Please call me." Daniel replied 2 days later. "There's nothing to talk about. I sent you what I found. Do whatever you think is right. I won't be part of it either way." Thomas tried Claire next, breaking his promise to respect her wish for no contact. He called her office number, got her assistant, left a message saying it was urgent, family-related, not about money. She didn't call back. He drafted a letter explaining everything. The journal entries, the forged documents, their father's calculated cruelty. He rewrote it 7 times, trying to find words that would make Claire and Daniel understand that he'd been deceived too, that he was a victim of the same manipulations. Every version sounded defensive, self-serving, like exactly what someone guilty would write. March arrived. Thomas began having trouble sleeping. He'd lie awake in the bedroom that had been his father's, staring at the ceiling, running through scenarios that all ended badly. If he came forward with the truth, he risked criminal investigation and professional ruin. If he stayed silent, he remained complicit in his father's revenge, kept an inheritance he now understood was designed specifically to poison his relationships with everyone he loved. Rachel noticed. Of course she noticed. She'd been noticing for months, had been patient while he'd worked through what she assumed was grief. But patience had limits. "I need to know what's going on," she said one night. "You're barely here even when you're here. The girls have stopped trying to talk to you about anything real. I'm starting to wonder if there's something you're not telling me." He wanted to tell her everything. Instead, he said, "My father left a complicated situation. All estates are complicated. This is something else. I'm handling it." "Are you?" "Because from where I'm sitting, it's handling you." She left the room before he could respond. He heard her go downstairs, heard the front door open and close. She'd started taking walks when they fought, needing space in a way she never had before. The brownstone, which was supposed to be their fresh start, had become something else entirely. Thomas returned to the study and pulled out the forged documents. He examined his signature under the desk lamp. It was good, nearly perfect. His father had practiced, had studied Thomas's handwriting carefully enough to replicate it convincingly. The dedication to the deception was almost impressive, if you could divorce it from the malice. He thought about his father's final question in the journal: will he keep everything, or will he prove himself better than me? The answer was obvious now. His father had made sure there was no way for Thomas to prove himself better. Every path led to destruction. Keeping the inheritance made him complicit. Giving it back risked exposure of the forged documents. Revealing the forgery destroyed his reputation. Staying silent destroyed his family. It was, Thomas realized, exactly what his father had intended. Not a test, but a final demonstration of contempt. A last lesson about how the world actually worked, delivered from beyond the grave. His phone buzzed. An unknown number, text message. "This is Claire. Don't call my office again. If you need to tell me something, write it. Send it to my home address. You get one letter, make it count." She'd included her address in San Francisco. Thomas stared at it for a long time, then opened his laptop and began writing. Not a justification or a defense, but the truth, all of it. The journal, the forged documents, his own paralysis, his father's calculated cruelty. He wrote for 3 hours, deleted half of it, rewrote it, deleted more. What remained was stark and unflattering. A confession that he'd been blind, that he'd accepted too easily, that he'd let months pass without questioning what he'd been given. He ended with a proposal: split everything equally, regardless of what the forged documents might reveal if anyone investigated. Let their father's cruelty end with this generation. Let them choose to be better than he was. He printed the letter, addressed the envelope, and placed it on his desk. Tomorrow he would mail it. Tonight he would tell Rachel everything and accept whatever came next. But when he went downstairs, he found her in the living room with a document of her own. Property assessment, renovation estimates, a realtor's projection of what the brownstone would sell for in the current market. "I've been thinking," Rachel said quietly, "maybe we should sell this place. Start over somewhere that doesn't feel so heavy." Thomas looked at his wife, at the evidence of her own escape plan, and felt something break open in his chest. She'd been preparing to leave the house, maybe more than the house, and he'd been so consumed by his father's ghost that he hadn't seen her slipping away. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Everything. And after I do, I'll understand if you want to leave." Rachel set down the documents and looked at him, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time in months. "Okay," she said. "I'm listening." Rachel listened without interrupting. Thomas told her about the journal, about his father's explicit acknowledgement of using the will as a weapon. He told her about the forged documents Daniel had sent, about the trap his father had built, about the impossible choice between guilt and exposure. He watched her face change as she understood the full scope of what they'd inherited. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then, "How long have you known about the journal?" Since October. 5 months. She said it flatly, a statement of fact that carried all the disappointment she was too controlled to express directly. You've known for 5 months that everything about this house, this inheritance, was built on manipulation, and you didn't tell me. I was trying to figure out what to do. No, Rachel said. You were trying to avoid consequences. There's a difference. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened street. I gave up my job to move here. I pulled the girls out of their school, away from their friends. I spent months turning this place into our home, and the entire time you knew it was poison. The house isn't poison, my father was. You don't get to separate those things, Rachel said. This house is what your father used to hurt his children. Living here, letting our daughters think this is normal, that this is what family legacy looks like, that makes us part of it. Thomas felt his defenses rising. I was trying to protect you. From what? From having a say in decisions that affect our entire family, from knowing the truth about where we live. She turned to face him. Or were you protecting yourself from having to actually deal with this instead of just dwelling on it? The accusation landed because it was true. He'd spent 5 months reading and rereading the journal, drafting emails he never sent, researching laws he would never use. He'd been performing the appearance of moral struggle without taking any actual moral action. I wrote a letter to Claire tonight, he said, explaining everything, proposing we split the inheritance equally. And the forged documents? I'll risk it. If they come out, if there's an investigation, I'll deal with it. Rachel was quiet again, evaluating. What does split equally mean? The house, the money, the company. Everything, a third each. And us? The girls? We've been living here for 9 months. We sold our house. You're talking about giving away roughly $2 million. Have you thought about what that means for Emily's college fund? For our retirement? For any kind of financial security? There it was, the practical question he'd been avoiding. Doing the right thing would cost them. Not everything, but enough to hurt. They'd be comfortable but not wealthy, stable but not secure. The consulting business provided good income, but without the inheritance cushion, every financial decision would matter again. I know, Thomas said, but I can't keep it, not anymore. That's easy for you to say. You're the one who gets the moral redemption. The rest of us just lose the house and the money and have to pretend we're fine with it. So what are you saying? That I should keep it? That we should just live with what he did? I'm saying that you don't get to unilaterally make this decision and expect me to applaud your conscience. If you're going to give away our security, I need to be part of that choice. We need to be part of it. She was right, of course. He'd been treating this as his personal moral crisis, his burden to resolve. But Rachel had made life decisions based on this inheritance. So had Emily and Sophie in their own ways. His father's cruelty had infected all of them, and Thomas's delayed recognition of it didn't entitle him to be the sole decision-maker about what came next. They talked until nearly 3 in the morning, working through scenarios and possibilities. Rachel wanted to see the numbers clearly, what they'd keep, what they'd give back, what their life would look like after. Thomas called his accountant the next morning, explained the situation in broad terms, got concrete figures. The 3-way split would leave them with the equity from their previous house plus roughly $400,000. Comfortable, but a dramatic change from the multi-million-dollar cushion they'd been living with. They'd need to sell the brownstone, find something smaller, cheaper. Emily and Sophie would need to adjust expectations. Rachel agreed eventually to support the decision, but her agreement came with conditions: complete transparency from now on, couples therapy to address the trust he'd damaged, and Thomas taking full responsibility for explaining to the girls why they were leaving the house they'd just started calling home. He mailed the letter to Claire on a Tuesday. Her response arrived Friday, a brief email. I'll want my lawyer to review any actual proposal, but assuming you're serious, yes, we should fix this. Daniel took longer. 3 weeks passed before Thomas got a phone call from a Thai number. I'm surprised, Daniel said without preamble. I thought you'd keep it. I thought about it. And? I don't want to be who he thought I was. Daniel laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. None of us get to decide who we are to other people. He thought I was a failure and Claire was cold and you were weak. We can disagree, but we can't change what he believed. We can choose not to prove him right. Maybe. Daniel was quiet for a moment. I don't want the money. I have everything I need here, but I want Dad's first editions, the Hemingway collection. He bought those books when he was young, before any of us existed. They're the only part of him I actually remember liking. They're yours, Thomas said, and I want you to acknowledge something. What? That you thought you were better than us. Not consciously, maybe, but underneath. You thought your way was right, staying close, being responsible, playing the dutiful son. You thought Claire and I were selfish for living our own lives. Maybe you didn't say it, but you felt it. Dad felt it too. That's why he chose you. Not because you were better, but because you already believed you were. Thomas wanted to deny it, to defend himself against the accusation, but sitting in the study, surrounded by the evidence of his father's contempt and his own complicity, he couldn't find the words to make denial sound true. You're right, he said finally. Well, Daniel said, that's something at least. They worked out the details over the following weeks. Claire's lawyer drafted the agreement. The house would be sold, the proceeds divided equally after settling outstanding estate taxes and fees. The publishing company would be dissolved, its assets liquidated. Each sibling would receive approximately $780,000. Thomas would keep the Brownstones' furnishings since he'd been living there. Daniel would get the first editions. Claire asked for their mother's jewelry, which Thomas hadn't even realized was in the house until she mentioned it. Rachel found a house in Oak Park, smaller but with good schools and a reasonable commute to the city. They'd have to downsize significantly, sell furniture, pare down possessions. Emily took the news badly, accused Thomas of giving away her room, her school, her entire life for reasons she couldn't understand. Sophie was quieter, but Thomas caught her crying in her room one evening. I liked it here, Sophie said when he asked what was wrong. It felt like we finally had enough space, like we belonged somewhere. Thomas sat on the edge of her bed, this small daughter who'd inherited his tendency to internalize pain rather than express it. We belong together, he said. That's not about the house. But you're making us leave because of something your dad did. That's not fair. She was 10 years old and had identified the essential injustice. His father's cruelty was still causing damage, still forcing choices, still shaping their lives. There was no way to escape that, no clean ending where everyone got what they deserved. You're right, Thomas said. It's not fair, but staying here would be worse. Sometimes all the choices are bad, and you have to pick the least bad one. That's a terrible answer. I know. The Brownstone sold in July for slightly more than projected. The closing took place on a Thursday. Thomas signed the papers in the same lawyer's office where he'd accepted the inheritance 16 months earlier. This time Claire was there, sitting across the conference table, professional and distant. Daniel joined via video call from Thailand, his face pixelated and small on the screen. The estate was finally settled. Each sibling received their share. Claire shook Thomas's hand, a formal gesture empty of warmth. I'm glad you did this, she said. I don't forgive the fact that you didn't do it sooner, or that Dad had to die for you to question things. But I'm glad. Daniel's face on the screen was hard to read across the connection lag. Take care of yourself, he said, and maybe talk to someone. A therapist, I mean. This family fucked all of us up in different ways. Might help to work through it. After the meeting, Thomas sat in his car in the parking garage for 20 minutes, unable to make himself drive home. The check from the estate sale was in his jacket pocket, a number that represented security but not wealth, comfort but not excess. He'd done the right thing, he told himself. He'd corrected an injustice. He'd refused to let his father's cruelty determine his own character. But the victory felt hollow. Claire's polite distance, Daniel's wary acknowledgement, these were not reconciliation. They were acceptance that the damage was done, that they could be civil but never close again. His father had destroyed their family bonds, and Thomas's attempt to repair them had come too late and accomplished too little. He started the car and drove toward Oak Park, toward the smaller house where Rachel and the girls were unpacking boxes, where they would build a life that looked nothing like what they'd expected. The brownstone was gone, sold to a young tech executive who'd never know its history. And Thomas was left with a cleared conscience and an emptier future, uncertain which mattered more. Thomas woke up on the second Saturday of October to the smell of pancakes. Rachel had started cooking breakfast on weekends, a ritual she'd imported from their old life before the brownstone, before the inheritance, before everything got complicated. It felt like an act of deliberate nostalgia, a choosing to remember who they'd been. He found her in the kitchen of their Oak Park house, Sophie setting the table, Emily on her phone but at least present in the room. This place was smaller, the kitchen visible from the living room, no separate study for him to disappear into. It forced proximity, eliminated the hiding places that had allowed him to drift away from his family while remaining technically present. "Claire emailed," Rachel said without looking up from the stove. "She wants to know if we'd like to meet for coffee next month. She'll be in Chicago for a conference." Thomas poured himself coffee, considering. He and Claire had exchanged perhaps a dozen emails in the past year, all cordial, none particularly warm. Status updates mostly. She'd used her inheritance to buy a house in Marin County. He'd used his to pay off their mortgage and set up college funds for the girls that weren't as generous as originally planned, but were still adequate. They were siblings who acknowledged each other's existence without particularly enriching it. "Tell her yes," he said. "We'll meet her." Rachel flipped a pancake, her back still to him. "We? You think she wants to see me and the girls?" "I don't know what she wants, but I'm tired of navigating this alone." Something softened in Rachel's shoulders. This had been the real work of the past year, not the legal settlements or the property transfers, but rebuilding the trust he'd damaged by treating his moral crisis as private property. The therapy had helped, though Thomas had resisted it initially, uncomfortable with the idea of explaining his family's dysfunction to a stranger. But Dr. Morrison had been patient, asked good questions, helped him understand that keeping secrets in the name of protection was just control wearing a benevolent mask. Emily appeared at his elbow, holding out her phone. "Aunt Claire posted pictures of her house. It's really nice. Can we visit sometime?" Thomas looked at the photos. A California bungalow with a garden, sunlight streaming through large windows, Claire smiling in a way he hadn't seen in years. She looked lighter, untethered, like someone who'd been carrying weight and finally set it down. "Maybe," Thomas said, "if she invites us." "Why wouldn't she invite us?" "Because I spent 5 months lying by omission, because I let myself believe I was the victim instead of recognizing I was complicit. Because family bonds, once broken, don't heal just because you apologize." He didn't say any of this to his 13-year-old daughter. "Sometimes adult relationships are complicated," he said, the insufficient answer parents give when the truth is too messy. Emily rolled her eyes but didn't push further. She'd been angry with him for most of the past year, angry about leaving the brownstone, angry about changing schools, angry in that adolescent way that was really anger about not being consulted before her life was rearranged. They were slowly rebuilding, mostly through his willingness to let her be angry without trying to defend himself or minimize her feelings. After breakfast, Thomas went for a run through the neighborhood. This was another new ritual, started at Rachel's suggestion. "You need to move," she'd said. "You've been living in your head for 2 years." She was right. Running forced him into his body, into the present moment, away from the endless recursive thoughts about what he should have done differently. He ran past the park where Sophie played soccer, past the library where Emily reluctantly admitted she'd found a good book club, past the houses that looked nothing like the brownstone with its high ceilings and historic details. This neighborhood was ordinary, full of families like his own, people living normal-sized lives. It felt, Thomas had to admit, like relief. When he returned home, he found a package on the front porch. No return address, but postmarked from Thailand. Inside was a book, a first edition of The Sun Also Rises, Hemingway's novel about expatriates trying to find meaning after everything they'd believed in had been destroyed. There was a note tucked inside, Daniel's handwriting. "Found this in Dad's collection. Not the most valuable, but it was always my favorite. Figure you should have it. Also figure you'll understand why I'm sending this particular one. We're all just trying to figure out how to live after, aren't we? Take care of yourself. D." Thomas sat on the porch steps holding the book, this small gesture of reconciliation from the brother who'd been most willing to walk away entirely. He opened it carefully, found his father's name inscribed on the inside cover in younger handwriting, dated 1979. Before marriage, before children, before all the disappointments that would turn a young publisher into the bitter man who weaponized his estate. He thought about his father sometimes, not with anger anymore, but with something closer to pity. That his father had lived to 73 and found his most significant act to be punishing his children for not loving him correctly seemed unbearably sad. All that time, all that life, and the only legacy that mattered to him was ensuring everyone knew they'd failed him. Rachel came out and sat beside him on the steps. From Daniel, he showed her the book. A peace offering, maybe, or an acknowledgement. I'm not entirely sure. Does it matter which? No, Thomas said. I guess it doesn't. They sat in comfortable silence watching the street. A couple walked past with a dog. A kid rode by on a bicycle. Normal Saturday morning activity that would have been invisible from the brownstone's elevated isolation. I've been thinking about your father's question, Rachel said. The one in his journal about whether you'd keep everything or prove yourself better than him. I think about it too. I don't think it was actually a test, Rachel said. Tests have right answers. I think he just wanted to make sure that no matter what you chose, you'd feel like you'd failed. Keep it and you're complicit. Give it back and you've sacrificed your family's security for abstract principles. Either way, you lose. That was the point. Thomas had arrived at the same conclusion over many sleepless nights. His father's cruelty had been comprehensive, designed to cause damage regardless of Thomas's response. Recognizing this should have made him feel better, should have absolved him of some responsibility. Instead, it just made him sad. Sad for his father, sad for the family they'd never really been, sad for all the years they'd spent pretending. I think, Thomas said slowly, that I did fail. Not the way he expected, but I failed anyway. I took too long to act. I prioritized avoiding discomfort over doing what was right. I let you and the girls build a life in that house, even though I knew it was built on something rotten. Yes, Rachel said simply. You did. The acknowledgement should have hurt. Instead, it felt like exhaling, like finally setting down a weight he'd been pretending wasn't heavy. But you also fixed it, Rachel continued. Late, messily, imperfectly, but you fixed it. You chose your siblings over your comfort. You chose honesty over the easy lie. That's not nothing. It doesn't feel like enough. It's not supposed to feel like enough. If it felt like enough, you wouldn't have learned anything. Emily appeared at the door. Mom, Sophie needs help with her math homework, and I'm definitely not helping her because she's being annoying. Rachel stood, squeezed Thomas's shoulder and went inside. Thomas remained on the steps with Hemingway's novel, this gift from a brother who understood about trying to live after everything meaningful had been dismantled. That evening, after dinner, Thomas drafted an email to Claire confirming they'd meet for coffee when she was in Chicago. He added a line he hadn't planned. If you'd like, maybe we could have dinner afterward. Rachel and the girls would love to see you properly. I know I don't have the right to ask for that, but I'm asking anyway. He sent it before he could reconsider. Claire's response came 2 hours later. Dinner sounds good. Let's try. 2 words that weren't forgiveness, weren't reconciliation, but were possibility. That, Thomas was learning, was what you built on after everything else had been taken away. Not grand gestures or dramatic redemptions, but small acknowledgements that maybe eventually there could be something resembling family again. He went upstairs and found Sophie in her room reading. She looked up when he knocked, cautious in the way she'd been since the move, like she was still waiting for the next upheaval. I wanted to say I'm sorry, Thomas said, for all the changes, for not explaining things better, for making decisions that affected you without really thinking about what you needed. Sophie considered this, with the seriousness of children who've learned not to accept easy apologies. Are you going to do it again? Make us move or change things without asking? I hope not, but I can't promise I won't make mistakes. I can promise to include you more in decisions, and to be honest when things are hard. That would be good, Sophie said. Then, surprising him, I like this house better anyway. My room's smaller, but I can hear you and Mom downstairs. In the other house, I always felt like I was too far away from everyone." Thomas felt something catch in his chest. He'd been so focused on what they'd lost, on the material downgrade and the social implications, that he hadn't considered what they might have gained. Proximity, visibility, the inability to hide from each other. He kissed Sophie's forehead and went to find Emily, who was in her room with headphones on, video chatting with friends. She pulled one headphone off when he knocked. "What?" "Just wanted to say goodnight." "It's like 8:30. "I know, but I'm saying it anyway." Emily gave him a look that was pure teenage exasperation, mixed with something that might have been affection. "You're being weird." "Probably," Thomas agreed. "Love you anyway." "Yeah, okay. Love you too." He went downstairs and found Rachel in the living room with a book, their nightly ritual. She moved her feet so he could sit on the couch, then put them back in his lap. They'd been married for 16 years, together for 19. They'd survived his father's death, his moral crisis, a year of painful honesty and the humbling recognition that neither of them was quite who they'd thought they were. And somehow they were still here, still choosing each other, still building something that looked like home. "Do you ever miss it?" Rachel asked. "The brownstone?" Thomas thought about it honestly. Did he miss the high ceilings, the historic details, the sense of having arrived at some meaningful destination? Sometimes. But mostly what he felt was relief at no longer having to carry the weight of what that house represented. "No," he said, "I miss who I thought I was when we lived there, but I don't miss the house." Rachel nodded, satisfied with the answer. They read in comfortable silence until Sophie appeared asking for help with a project, and then Emily needed someone to quiz her on vocabulary, and the evening dissolved into the ordinary chaos of family life. Thomas moved through it all with a presence he hadn't managed in the brownstone, where his father's ghost had occupied every room, demanding attention, demanding answers to questions that had no good solutions. Later, lying in bed in the darkness, Rachel's breathing settling into sleep, Thomas thought about his father's final words in the journal. "Let him decide what to do with it. That's my final test for him." His father had been wrong. It wasn't a test. It was an inheritance far more significant than property or money. It was the burden of recognizing cruelty, of understanding how good intentions could mask selfishness, of learning that proximity didn't equal virtue. It was the gift, painful, unwanted, but ultimately valuable, of being forced to examine his own complicity and choose whether to perpetuate what he'd inherited or build something different. He'd chosen differently, late, imperfectly, at significant cost, but he'd chosen. And in that choice, he'd finally become separate from his father, not the dutiful son performing responsibility, but a man willing to accept discomfort in service of something better. The house settled around him with unfamiliar sounds, nothing like the brownstone's distinctive creaks. This place had no history, no ghosts, no legacy to maintain. It was just a house, ordinary and sufficient, filled with people he loved and was learning to show up for honestly.